Imagine owning a territory that's larger than your own country and having to build everything from scratch with no help at all. That was the reality many grantees of the hereditary captaincies in Brazil had to deal with, receiving large tracts of land from the King of Portugal. They had to deal with hunger, uprisings, cannibals, and shipwrecks, which meant that only 2 out of the 15 captaincies would prosper. But what then was the fate of the other 13? How did each of the donatarios of Brazil die? What was behind each of the failures to establish themselves in their captaincies? In today's video, we'll discuss the failed captaincies in Portuguese Brazil and how Portuguese nobles ended up devoured by the sea, by intrigues, and by natives in their attempt to occupy Brazil. To understand why so many captaincies failed, we first need to understand why they were created. In the 16th century, Portugal spent a large part of its human resources investing in going to India in search of spices. Spices were used not only as seasonings, but above all, as medicine. Cinnamon is still used today to relieve pain. Imagine back then when medicine was not so advanced. So, the India run was almost like a floating pharmaceutical industry. In some areas, spices were nearly as valuable as gold by the gram. As a result, Brazil, which is huge, is almost unprotected. And it was common for the French and even the English to roam freely along the coast of the territory, exploiting Brazil wood. So the King of Portugal saw the territory falling more and more each day into the hands of foreign powers. This was happening while Portugal had a tiny population of only 1 million inhabitants. And even though Dom João sent bodyguard expeditions to capture foreign ships along the coast, it wasn't enough. It was necessary to occupy territory. And that's when Dom João III decided to occupy Brazil, copying an experience that had been successful in other Portuguese islands, the hereditary captaincies. This model consisted of subdividing territory and handing it over to captains who would lead that portion of land and could later subdivide them into sesmarias. That way, they would keep subdividing and handing over land to other nobles and gentlemen of the kingdom, almost like a feudal system. Thus, through the captaincy system, the King of Portugal planned to finally occupy Brazil and place this task in the hands of the Portuguese nobility. Thus, a nobleman granted a captaincy by the king had everything, yet nothing at all. Overnight, a simple Portuguese nobleman who managed just a few castles and villages would gain territories larger than Portugal itself and many kingdoms in Europe, and who could govern in the name of the king. But on the other hand, as great as these stretches of land were, so were his responsibilities. The donataries had to organize with their own resources expeditions with ships, men, supplies, wages, and horses to cross the ocean and found cities in the middle of a hostile tropical hot land with thousands of hostile natives deep in the forest. It was truly a colossal task. Receiving this gift from Dom João III was at the same time a blessing and a kind of curse. And so, 3 donataries decided to join forces to face the challenge of occupying the north of Brazil. Leading this endeavor was João de Barros, a cultured man, a grammar author, and considered the first great Portuguese historian. João, together with Aires da Cunha, had received 2 strips of land, the captaincy of Rio Grande and the first section of Maranhão, on the border with the domains of Castile, near the mouth of the Amazon. And to handle the mission of occupying 2 distinct and distant territories, he partnered with 2 neighboring donatarios of captaincy, Aires da Cunha and Fernão Álvares de Andrade, in a kind of colonization consortium. The 3 captaincies were side by side, separated only by that of Queira, which made the partnership very strategic. Since João was wealthy and influential, holding many crown positions, he would sponsor much of the expedition, and the others would take possession of the territories and develop the captaincies. including João's, whose sons would also embark on the journey. He spent a year preparing a massive expedition. Ships, men, weapons, supplies, and horses, all funded from his own pocket. And the expedition he assembled in 1535 was grand, with a mini army heading to the New World. His fleet was made up of 10 ships and 900 men, with 113 of them being cavalry. In this expedition, 2 Grantees were assigned to establish cities and fortresses in northern Brazil, specifically in Rio Grande and Maranhão. But when they reached the coast of Rio Grande do Norte at Cabo São Roque, a storm hit the fleet. And because of that, the ship carrying the Grantee Ares de Cunha sank, and the Grantee ended up dying. Another ship was lost, drifting until it was found by Spanish sailors, who took it to the island of Santo Domingo in the Caribbean. And so, only 8 ships made it to Maranhão, and there they founded a village called Nazaré, led by Donatari Fernão Álvares de Andrade and João de Barros' sons. João de Barros, in Portugal, paid compensation to the families of all those who died in the shipwreck, and provided pensions for the orphans and widows of everyone who was killed in that failed expedition. But that would not be the only tragic end involving Donataries. Another one who had terrible luck was Antonio Cardoso de Barros from the Captaincy of Ceará. Records indicate that he only came to Brazil in 1549 a year after the establishment of the general government, and he spent more than 19 years without setting foot in his captaincy. And when he came to Brazil, instead of going to Ceará, he actually went to Salvador. He was more concerned with his position as treasurer than with the lands he had the right to claim on the coast of Ceará. However, after many disagreements with Governor Duarte da Costa, he decided to return to Portugal with Bishop Sardinha to complain to the king about the governor's conduct. But he ends up suffering a shipwreck on the coast of Alagoas. And, after managing to take refuge on the beach, both he and the bishop were killed and eaten by the Caete Indians, who were cannibals. According to Barão de Studart, in 1614, ruins of a lime and stone house in the European style were found in the locality of Camusim in Ceará. This indicates a probable European attempt to settle there. However, the renowned historian from Ceará says it can't be claimed it belonged to Antonio Cardoso. Although he sailed along the northeast coast, he did not mention landing in the captaincy. And Antonio wouldn't be the only grantee devoured by natives. In the Bay of All Saints, the grantee and nobleman Francisco Pereira Coutinho founded the Arraial do Pereira, which also, over time, had to be abandoned due to conflict with the natives. Francisco, called Rusticão, often clashed with the Indians due to his rude and rough nature. Father João Bezerra, realizing the disaster of the captaincy and the decline of the governor, presented a false decree that removed him from command of the captaincy. And so, everyone abandoned the settlement and left to live with the castaway Caramuru and his tribe. However, a year later, when he tried to go to Portugal, his vessel was damaged by reefs in the south of Itaparica. And when the vessel sank, the Donatario, reaching the coast, was captured by the Pinambás Indians, restrained and executed. All this just to be eaten in a cannibalistic ritual. Another captaincy that failed was that of Pero Campo Turinho, Donatario of the Captaincy of Porto Seguro. Interestingly, this captaincy didn't fail due to natives or castaways, but because of the captain himself. Arriving on the shores with more than 600 men, the Donatario wanted everyone to work without stopping, and soon showed himself to be a great blasphemer. He didn't respect holy days, wanted everyone to work on Sundays, and didn't respect anyone's social status. Because of this, he was reported to the Inquisition and received a light sentence from the court. So the conflict with the settlers was what caused his captaincy not to prosper. Another captain was Jorge Figueiredo Correa, who was given the captaincy of Ilhéus. The Donatary, a nobleman fond of palace life, never traveled to Brazil to assume his captaincy, but he sent the Castilian Francisco Romero to administer the territory and found a town that would be called São Jorge de Ilhéus. And the captaincy began to prosper greatly in its early days, thanks to Romero's excellent administration, who distributed sesmarias to very competent men, among them the future governor, Mem de Sá, and also to Fernão Álvares de Andrade, who, after surviving the shipwreck in Maranhão, saw in Ilhéus the opportunity to build a sugar mill in a place where sugarcane thrived. And little by little, Ilhéus was already filled with productive mills thanks to the successful cultivation of sugarcane. However, the captaincy would be completely devastated after a war with the Aimoré Indians, who destroyed everything. After the war with the Indians, the captaincy was abandoned, with all the sugar mills and buildings there left behind. But one of the most dramatic stories of captains was that of Espírito Santo, under the command of Vasco Fernandes Coutinho. Vasco was a prominent captain who gathered a troop of noblemen and exiles to try to establish a captaincy in Brazil. In Brazil, he did his best to integrate with the natives. He picked up the habit of smoking and other indigenous customs. Because of that, he was excommunicated by Bishop Sardinha, who died after being devoured together with the Donatary of Xerá. Vasco fought against hostile tribes, founded villages, but his captaincy fell into disgrace due to insubordination from his own men. As historian Francisco Adolfo von Hagen rightly pointed out, the disorder that this captaincy reached and the lack of respect for the Donatarian governor were reasons why the natives were encouraged to attack it several times and to exile the best settlers. So the captaincy of Espírito Santo, with such good lands and such an excellent port, with navigable rivers leading inland, remained undeveloped up to our times, and the population, which does not thrive, is reduced to a land whose virgin forests are almost all still untouched. Thus, the captaincy of Espírito Santo was another victim of the disorder that led the indigenous people to attack, and this failure resulted in the complete ruin of the Donatario. The death of Vasco is portrayed in the historiography of Gabriel Soares de Souza from 1587, who reports that in settling this captaincy, Vasco Fernandes Coutinho spent many cruzados, which he acquired in India and sold all his assets, and that he ended up so poor that he begged for food and was without even a sheet to keep himself warm. And his son, with the same name, now lives in the same captaincy, so needy that he has little more than the title of governor. Modern historiography tends to revisit this 16th century version of Vasco's death, claiming that he did not die in misery. However, another Donatary close to him, Portuguese, also had his territory devastated by natives. Portuguese was the Donatary of the captaincy of São Tomé, located today in what would be the northern part of Rio de Janeiro. In his territory, he started a sugarcane plantation which he brought from the captaincy of São Vicente, and he even founded a settlement on the banks of a river called Vila da Rainha. But he had to go to Portugal to get tools for building sugar mills. And when he returned, he found the captaincy abandoned due to conflict with the Goitacazes and the Puris, which made his enterprise fail completely. He would then focus on assisting Martim Afonso de Souza in São Vicente. Pero Lopes de Souza was the brother of the famous Donatario Martim Afonso de Souza. He received the captaincies of Itamaracá, now Paraíba, Santo Amaro, Rio de Janeiro, and Santana, southern Brazil. In 1530, he joined his brother at São Vicente's founding. And Pero Lopes is famous for writing a book called Navigation Diary, in which he describes in detail the 16th century mindset. Besides the journey, along with Martim Afonso de Souza, through Rio de Janeiro and other places, until finally managing to make his brother's captaincy prosper. In 1532, he decided to return to Portugal, and on the way back he captured 2 French ships that were passing through Pernambuco. Thus, he received more favors from Dom Juan III. However, Pero Lopez did not actually occupy his lands. In fact, instead of that, he was put in charge of leading an expedition to India where he would die in a shipwreck off the coast of Madagascar. So we see that the donatary captains threw themselves headfirst into ventures that cost more than just fortune. They paid with their lives. Noble men who left behind palaces and titles to face a hostile land where everything was strange: the climate, the forest, the language, and the diseases. Some would die in shipwrecks before even setting foot on these lands, others destroyed by the colonists themselves, others at the hands of the indigenous people, and others completely ruined, begging for survival. On paper, they ruled territories as large as kingdoms, but in reality, they were entrepreneurs who took big risks, enough to have to pay with their own lives. People who had everything and at the same time had nothing. Did you know the story of the Grantees who failed? What surprised you the most? So leave your comment right now to support our work, and take the opportunity to become a member of the channel right now. That way you'll be able to dive deeper and learn even more about the fascinating Iberian history.